We are talking about Reconstruction now. So under Reconstruction, first of all, a lot of the former planters is what we call them, the planter class, or the former enslavers, right, were distraught because the Southern economy was built on the backs of owning human capital. And to have to move immediately from owning that human capital, living on plantations, for that being the identity of wealth in the South, to then overnight essentially having to readjust the interactions, to readjust the economic prospects, and to really, because most of the time the peoples whom they owned, they were able to pay off debts with, and to not be able to do that anymore, then it left the southern planters scrambling. Not only that, we have what we call Reconstruction Amendments. Our Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution are our 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so if you don't know these amendments, then I'm going to tell you now, you need to get out a pen and paper, and you need to commit these to your memory and your understanding. These are arguably some of the most important amendments in American history. The 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolished enslavement. Now, here's the thing. There is a caveat in this amendment. And so the caveat in this amendment, unfortunately, is going to lead to 20th and 21st century downfall. Actually, it's going to be downfall for peoples of color, especially Black and Brown people, from the time this amendment was put in place all the way to present day. But essentially, the caveat is that people are not allowed to be enslaved unless they are imprisoned. Unless they are imprisoned, which means that once someone is imprisoned, when they're serving in a jail or in a prison, then the United States not only has the right, but has the privilege of extracting their labor for free or for pennies on the dollar. And they do not have really an opportunity to to refuse the kind of labor that they're supposed to be doing. This is why you found so many people who were initially enslaved and then they were free, subsequently very quickly being criminalized and being imprisoned, and then having to work on things like the chain gangs, having to forge new railroads, right? Because America needed industry. All the things of industry that function for the United States are actually in large part fueled by the people who are behind the walls of prisons and jails. Okay. So then we have the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment said that the states could not take away the rights of citizens without due process of the law. Due process of the law is something that is a federal requirement, but it varies from location to location. So that authorized essentially southern states and even northern states. Let's not act like there wasn't racism or even enslavement in the North. That's just a diabolical lie if you think that that never happened in the North. Obviously it did. What it means is that there's a workaround, but the biggest workaround happens in the 13th Amendment. The 15th Amendment says that let's look at that again, all what? Men have the right to vote no matter the color. So the 15th Amendment even leaves out women. So that actually means under the terms of Reconstruction, under the terms of this amendment, that not even white women had the right to vote before Black men had the right to vote. But we all know that there were barriers to voting, right? You had to pass literacy tests. Obviously, most of your newly enslaved people were no longer, your newly freed people who were once enslaved could not pass a literacy test. Or in places like Virginia, then they had to own a certain amount of property. So for example, in order to vote, they had to have, let's say, 20 pounds of tobacco. Well, who owned 20 pounds of tobacco at that time? Right, not your sharecroppers, right? It would be your white slave property owning men. So there were barriers that were put in place for these amendments, these 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, but they were designed initially to help try to ensure liberties. Now, there's another creation in 1865, which was called the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was, remember when I was talking about just a moment ago that there were plans essentially that was supposed to be put in place to help restabilize those Southern economies, to help white planters restabilize and essentially figure out how they were going to continue doing business. And it was supposed to help newly freed individuals to have the food, shelter, clothing, medical services, and land that they needed in order to continue with daily life, establish and continue daily life. And this was an act that was put in place by Senate in March of 1865. There was an objective. Ultimately, though, the Freedmen's Bureau failed. It failed because of infighting. And obviously, then there were white planters that found workarounds. Many of those workarounds included forcing Black people into sharecropping. Basically, what that means is that they were tied to the land because many of your formerly enslaved people had certain skill sets. Not most of them did not know how to read. Most of them were not blacksmiths, or most of them did not have directional wherewithal. So they didn't necessarily have places to go. So that was a way of tying them to the land without tying them to the land. Does that make sense? So most of your Southern former enslaved people became sharecroppers. And what this did was it placed Black people in a system of perpetual debt. So you had white planters come out and say, essentially, I don't have I need you on my land, and you're welcome to stay because I know you don't really have a place to go. And if you will farm my land, I will allow you to have some of the profits from it. Well, interestingly enough, they had to go into debt in order to do that. They had to have rent for that land, but they also didn't have the tools. The tools belonged to the planters. The seed belonged to the planters. And so they had to essentially borrow against what would be their first production of profit. And of course, that put them in the time of yield season, the harvest season. Then they would say you owe more, right, than you borrowed. But if you stay one more year, then I'll lend you again. And you couldn't just desert the land because you could go to prison for deserting the land without paying, which means that you would essentially be re-enslaved. Therefore, this system of perpetual sharecropping kept people on cotton fields and tobacco fields all over the American South. And it wasn't until we get to the 1920s, where we have the Great Southern Migration, that you actually have a large scale movement of Black people from the American South into the North. Okay. We also see the building up and the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. This was obviously out of fear of the ingenuity and ability of those of the Reconstructionists, and so the Ku Klux Klan were essentially going back to this idea of purity, of preserving purity. They were everywhere. Actually, they were in government, so they were in all three of the major bodies of government. They were in the judicial branch, the executive branch, the legislative branch. And most of the time they were not hooded. This idea of being hooded was not the first part of the Klan. This idea of being hooded was a development of Klan life. So they were allowed to wreak havoc in the name of Jesus, in the name of racial purity, and in the name of protecting the innocent. How do we know this? We know this, and we can see this exemplified in a 1915 film called The Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation came out as a film, a black and white film, and there was no talking really in this film, right? These were silent films that had people acting and music, but they didn't have any talking. And this film, essentially, they didn't have any African Americans. It had white men in blackface, and they portrayed the African American man, or the Black man, as they over sexualized him and they oversimplified him. They made it seem like in Congress you had these new Reconstructionist Black leaders that were just drinking in public in Congress, and they were passing illegitimate laws, and they were vilifying the white minority, which that was just impossible to have a white minority at that time. They over sexualized Black women. This film, it presented Black men as a danger to white purity, especially the white woman. And essentially, they said it was the only way that white purity could be protected is through a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this the birth of a nation caused the revival and large scale membership of the Ku Klux Klan all across the United States of America. And as a matter of fact, the president at the time, so mind you, I said this is 1915. That means that we are in the middle of World War I. The United States hadn't entered into the war at this time. They didn't enter into World War I until 1917. However, there is a great war happening, and the president of the United States, who was Woodrow Wilson, called the film, he said, it's like writing history with lightning. He heralded the film, he applauded the film. And as a matter of fact, he said this he held a private screening at the White House of Birth of a Nation, and then made a national statement saying that it was one of the best films that he'd ever seen, which essentially is undergirding a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Reconstruction era, unfortunately, did not last long because of really it's a governmental attempt. It was a social attempt. It was a national attempt to disrupt the Black and brown advancements in the United States. And so you see in the 1870s, the creation of what we now know as Jim Crow laws. And so those laws became laws all across the United States, but specifically focused on the American South. And it says the 1870s until 1964/1965 for a reason. We're going to see two different acts. One happened in 64, one happened in 65, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. But basically, Jim Crow was marked by, as many of you know, segregation. The generation before me, my mother's generation, and generations above hers, equal to and above hers, for sure know what Jim Crow felt like. This is when we saw redlining. This is when we saw forced impoverishment. This is also when we saw the pillaging and the massacres of Black Wall Streets. This is when we saw segregated buses. This is when we saw segregated schools. This is when we saw Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, segregated seating, and deep racism and violence all across the American South, especially, but also in the American North. Otherwise, how could we have a Tulsa, Oklahoma riot, right? If there wasn't segregation, if there wasn't racial violence. And so there were African Americans, and it's not just African Americans, right, but people of color across the board, because Jim Crow was targeted towards African Americans, but it was everyone who was not considered white. Let's be very clear about that. So the actions specifically of African Americans that fueled change were, you could see people like the rise of Marcus Garvey and the Black Star movement. You could see, and this came from that great Southern migration, because the migration didn't just come from the American South to the North, but it came from countries that are south of the United States, specifically our Caribbean countries. So you saw the rise of great minds like Marcus Garvey, and you saw the Harlem Renaissance and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC under Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You saw the rise of the NAACP at the turn of the 20th century under Du Bois, the rise of the Nation of Islam, the United Negro College Fund, the rise of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, because the PWIs, or predominantly white institutions, were not willing to educate Black children. Then those schools were created. The first one in 1865, Howard University, to educate Black children. And then also the National Council of Negro Women. Many of these organizations that I mentioned are actually still operational today, but that's how that was combated. Now, also during the civil rights era, so arguably the civil rights era started at the end of Reconstruction. Okay, so it started at the end of Reconstruction because there was a fight for rights, for civil rights, inalienable rights, human rights, from the time Reconstruction stopped until, right? So we're going to talk about until when. So we kept persistent pressure through boycotts and sit-ins and freedom rides, children's marches, otherwise also known as the Children's Crusade. For example, if you've ever heard of the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, led by Reverend Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, and also Dr. King and the SCLC. We saw militarization. We saw the rise of the Nation of Islam. We saw the Black Panthers, right? Pan-Africanism through Marcus Garvey, and through the rise of Nation of Islam and Black Panthers, and exposing hypocrisy during the Cold War. So the Cold War era actually became a very important time for the exposure of the way in which the United States, especially the American South, was treating its people of color. So in the Cold War, which the Cold War was from 1945 until 1991, the Cold War era, right, as we remember it, was the communism versus capitalism. This also included things like the Great Space Race and where people, the Soviet Union or the USSR and the United States were trying to race to get to the moon, and also the nuclear arms race and the Cuban Missile Crisis and communism versus capitalism, all of that. So the United States rose up as this great democratic nation where all people were created equal. Well, oh, how hypocritical if we say that we believe in equality and democracy and fairness, and we have Jim Crow laws, and we have lynchings, and we have the dismantling of systems that is supposed to empower people. So the Cold War era actually embarrassed the United States, so much so to where the presidents started to have to take action for more equitable laws. So the short of this is we see, obviously, I am moving really fast and I'm giving a big general sweep because this is an introduction. This is not a full-on course offering for you all. We have a full-on course offering available this summer, but this is we're closing out now.